All right, diving right in today. We're tackling a topic that I think a lot of folks have been wondering about. It's the whole smoking, vaping, and COVID-19 thing.
Yeah, it's definitely been a bit of a confusing landscape to navigate, especially in those early days.
For sure. I mean, everyone wants to know what the deal is, but it can be tough to sort through all the noise.
Totally. So for this deep dive, we've pulled together a few key sources that give us a good picture of what was known and what wasn't back when this was all first unfolding. We're looking at an opinion piece from Dr. Farsalinos. This one's from March 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, and it really captures those early discussions.
Oh, yeah, I remember when this first came out. It sparked a lot of conversation.
It did. We'll also be digging into an article that presents the case for why e-cigarettes might actually be a less harmful alternative to smoking. And then we'll wrap things up with a look at a pretty pointed critique of a study that tried to make a connection between vaping and some health problems.
So the goal here is to really help folks make sense of all this, right?
Absolutely. We're going to try to distill things down to the core insights, especially considering how much uncertainty there was in the early days.
Okay, so let's start with that early 2020 perspective from Dr. Farsalinos. Right off the bat, there was a lot of buzz about why men and women seem to be getting infected with COVID-19 at different rates. One of the early theories was that the smoking rates in China might be playing a role.
Yeah, I remember that.
According to Statista, something like 48% of men in China were smokers back then compared to just under 2% of women. So the thought was, maybe this difference in smoking habits could be driving the difference in infections.
It makes sense that people would start looking for explanations like that, especially when you've got such a huge disparity in smoking prevalence between men and women. But as the author points out, this was just a hypothesis. It hadn't actually been proven. It's a classic example of how correlation can be mistaken for causation.
Right. It's like just because two things happen around the same time doesn't mean one caused the other. So then the article goes on to look at some of those very first studies that actually looked at people with COVID-19 who were also smokers.
Yeah, those early studies were fascinating.
One of them was a really small study from China. I think it only involved 78 patients.
Tiny sample size.
Yeah, and it suggested that smokers had a much higher risk, like 14 times higher odds of their illness getting really bad.
A 14-fold increase. Wow, that does sound pretty dramatic.
It does, but here's the catch. Out of those 78 patients, only 5 were smokers.
Oh, wow. So very few smokers in the sample.
And even within those 5 smokers, only 3 of them actually got severely ill.
Huh. That really puts things into perspective.
It does, right? So even though that 14-fold number seems huge, with such a tiny group of smokers, it's really hard to say how accurate it actually is. The margin of error must be massive.
I see what you mean. It's like the true effect could be anywhere within a huge range, so you can't really draw any firm conclusions from that.
Exactly. And this is all happening in the middle of a pandemic when everyone is scrambling for answers. So it makes sense that even small studies like this got a lot of attention.
For sure.
Then they looked at a much bigger study. This one was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it had almost 1,100 people in it. But here's where things get kind of unexpected. The percentage of current smokers in this study was only about 12.6%. Former smokers were even lower, at just 1.9%.
Those numbers do seem lower than you might expect.
Yeah, especially considering that nearly everyone in the study was an adult, and over half were men.
Right, a demographic with historically higher smoking rates.
You would think, regardless of whether smoking actually made COVID-19 worse, you'd see more smokers in the group of people hospitalized with the virus, just based on how common smoking is.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Why were there seemingly fewer smokers in this group of COVID-19 patients than you might statistically expect?
It's a good question.
Now, we have to remember, this study only looked at confirmed cases, and most of them were sick enough to be in the hospital. So it doesn't tell us about everyone who might have gotten infected, just the ones who ended up needing hospital care.
Right, good point.
But it does make you wonder.
It does. They did find one thing, though. Among those hospitalized patients, the percentage of smokers was a bit higher in the group that got severely ill.
Oh, interesting. What was the difference?
About 17% of the severe cases were current smokers, compared to about 11.8% in the group with less severe illness.
So a slightly higher percentage of smokers among those with severe COVID.
But again, it's hard to say for sure what this means. The study couldn't control for all the other things that could have made someone more likely to get really sick, like age or other health problems.
Yeah, you need to account for those confounding factors to really tease out the specific impact of smoking.
Right. So big picture, the early evidence around smoking and COVID-19 was kind of all over the place.
A mixed bag, for
Yeah.
sure.
It seemed like maybe fewer smokers were getting hospitalized, but those who did might have been more likely to have a rougher time.
But the data was far from conclusive at that point.
Yeah, like you said earlier, it was really just a starting point.
More like a bunch of question marks than clear answers.
Exactly. Okay, so that's the early picture with smoking. Now let's talk about vaping and COVID. Again, we're still looking at that March 2020 article from Dr. Farsalinos. And he's very upfront about this. He basically says, look, we just don't know anything yet about how vaping impacts COVID-19.
Yeah, he states it pretty bluntly, and that is all I can say, i.e. nothing. We have zero evidence on how e-cigarette use affects coronavirus infectivity and disease progression.
That kind of honesty is refreshing, though, isn't it? Especially when there's so much pressure to have all the answers right away.
Absolutely. Sometimes the most truthful thing you can say is, we don't know yet, and then focus on finding out.
Totally. So at that point, there wasn't any evidence to say that vaping made you more likely to get COVID-19 or that it made your illness worse.
Right. That was all still unknown territory.
However, they do bring up some interesting research on one of the main ingredients in vaping liquids.
You mean propylene glycol?
Yeah, that's it. Apparently, there are studies way back in the 1940s looking at propylene glycol and its potential to kill bacteria and viruses.
Oh, wow. Way back then.
Yeah, they even mention a few of these studies by name. They found that when propylene glycol was aerosolized, it seemed to have some germ-killing properties.
So, like, it was potentially disinfecting the air.
That was the idea. And they were looking at this in the context of airborne infections like the flu. But, and this is a big but, the author makes it super clear that this research was not about the specific virus that causes COVID-19.
Right. That's an important distinction.
Yeah, so while it's kind of a cool tidbit about this ingredient in e-liquids, it doesn't actually tell us anything about vaping and COVID-19 specifically.
Yeah, it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges.
Exactly. Another important point that the article brings up is that a lot of people who vape either still smoke or used to smoke.
Dual users or former smokers.
Yep. And that means they might already have some health issues because of their smoking history. So if those folks do get sick, it can be hard to tell whether it's because of vaping or because of the damage from smoking.
Yeah, that makes it tough to isolate the effects of vaping.
It does. And it's something that's really important to keep in mind whenever you're looking at studies on the health effects of vaping.
Absolutely. Teasing out the independent effects of vaping, especially with so many people having a history of smoking, is a major challenge.
Okay, so given all this uncertainty back in early 2020, the advice in this article was pretty sensible.
What was it?
Basically, if you're smoking, try to quit. If you're using e-cigarettes to help you quit and it's working, don't stop vaping because you might go back to cigarettes.
That's solid advice.
And if you're a former smoker who's now vaping, you probably shouldn't quit vaping if it might lead you back to smoking.
So don't switch things up if it might increase your risk.
Exactly. And of course, if you've never smoked, don't start vaping thinking it's going to protect you from COVID.
Don't jump into something new based on unproven theories, especially when it comes to your health.
The author also had a call to action for the medical community. He was really pushing for more research.
Yeah, he specifically advocated for gathering data about people's smoking and vaping habits when they get diagnosed with COVID, for doing lab studies to see how propylene glycol interacts with the virus, and even for clinical trials using nebulized propylene glycol as a possible treatment.
It really shows how much we didn't know back then.
And it underscores the importance of rigorous research, especially in a situation that's so complex and rapidly evolving.
For sure. All right, let's shift gears now and look at this article called Unpacking the Truth. This one takes a much broader view and lays out the argument for why e-cigarettes might be a better choice than traditional cigarettes.
All right, let's unpack it.
They even go so far as to call regular cigarettes analog stinkies.
That's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, they don't mince words. Their main point is that e-cigarettes are less harmful because they don't actually burn anything.
It's about the absence of combustion.
Exactly. With traditional cigarettes, you're burning tobacco, and that creates tons of harmful chemicals. But with e-cigarettes, you're just heating a liquid to create a vapor.
Right. So it's about the delivery mechanism and the fact that vaping eliminates that whole burning process.
They go into a lot of detail about the chemicals involved, too. They talk about how cigarette smoke contains all these nasty things like tar, carbon monoxide, formaldehyde, arsenic.
Wow. Yeah, that's not a good mix.
Not at all. But with e-cigarettes, you're mainly getting propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, flavorings, and nicotine.
So while not harmless, a very different chemical profile compared to burning tobacco.
And they really emphasize that this lack of combustion is why vaping is likely less harmful than smoking.
That's really the core of the harm reduction argument.
Though it is important to remember, like you said, less harmful doesn't mean harmless.
For sure.
The article also argues that e-cigarettes could be a good thing for public health.
In what way?
They say vaping might help people quit smoking and improve their overall lung health.
It's definitely an ongoing debate whether e-cigarettes are a gateway to quitting smoking or a way to sustain nicotine addiction.
For sure. They also compare secondhand vapor to secondhand smoke.
Interesting.
They argue that the vapor has fewer toxins and disappears from the air more quickly.
Right, less lingering.
Exactly.
It's worth noting that while secondhand vapor is generally considered less harmful than secondhand smoke, it's still something that researchers are continuing to investigate.
Oh, absolutely. We're still learning about all of the potential impacts.
Definitely.
Another thing they bring up is how customizable vaping can be.
Oh, yeah, that's one of the big appeals.
You can change the nicotine strength, the temperature, and even the flavors. It gives people a lot of control over their experience.
Right, a lot of options to personalize it.
And they even touch on the environmental impact, saying that reusable vaping devices may be better for the planet than all those cigarette butts that end up everywhere.
That makes sense. I mean, every little bit helps when it comes to reducing waste.
Right. Okay, last but not least, we have that critique from Dr. Forcelinos. This one's from November 2020, and it's about a study from the American Heart Association. The study claimed that e-cigarette users reported having more symptoms that were similar to EVALI, and this was based on data from a survey done back in 2016.
Hold on, 2016? Wasn't EVALI a much later thing?
Exactly. And that's the whole crux of Dr. Forcelinos' argument.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
EVALI, which stands for e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury, really hit the radar in 2019. We later found out that it was largely linked to contaminants in black market THC vaping products. But this AHA study was using data from years before EVALI was even a thing.
So they were trying to apply a definition of symptoms from an outbreak that hadn't even happened yet to data that was collected years earlier.
Yep, and the author tears this approach apart. He points out how ridiculous it is to try to link symptoms that were specific to EVALI to data from 2016.
That's a pretty big methodological flaw.
It is. And to make things even more questionable, the symptoms they listed in the 2016 survey were super general things like dry mouth, cough, nausea, headache, loss of taste or smell, shortness of breath.
Yeah, those could be symptoms of a ton of different things.
Exactly. It could be a cold, it could be allergies. Heck, some of them even overlap with COVID-19 symptoms. So the author calls this study an insult for science and common sense.
Wow, he doesn't hold back.
Nope. And he also raises the issue of the creeping politicization of science. He suggests that maybe some of the negative views on vaping could be influencing how this research is being done and interpreted.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. It's crucial that research be objective and rigorous.
Absolutely. All right, so after going through all of this, what are the key takeaways? What should folks keep in mind?
Well, when it comes to smoking and COVID-19, the early data was messy and often contradictory. It hinted at a possible link between smoking and more severe COVID-19, but it wasn't definitive.
Yeah, and it definitely sparked the need for a lot more investigation.
Absolutely. As for vaping and COVID-19, there wasn't any direct evidence to suggest that vaping made you more likely to get infected or to have a worse outcome.
Yeah.
That whole area was a big unknown back then.
And still is to some extent.
Yeah, to some extent. We did learn about that interesting research on propylene glycol and its potential antiviral effects. But that research wasn't specific to the COVID-19 virus, so we can't really draw any conclusions from it.
But it's definitely an area ripe for further research. Now, if we zoom out and think about e-cigarettes in general, the argument that they're less harmful than smoking really hinges on the lack of combustion.
Right, that's the key difference. Without burning tobacco, you're significantly reducing your exposure to a whole bunch of nasty chemicals.
But it's important to be critical of any research on this topic and to be aware of potential flaws, like we saw in that AHA study that tried to retroactively link vaping to EVALI symptoms.
Always look for sound methodology and logical reasoning.
Absolutely. The big takeaway here is that when we're dealing with complex issues like this, especially during a rapidly evolving situation like a pandemic, the information can be really confusing.
You've got to be a savvy consumer of information.
Exactly. And always keep in mind that there might be different agendas at play. So question everything, look for the evidence, and don't be afraid to dig a little deeper.
And on that note, I have a question for you, the listener. Thinking about everything we've discussed today, about the motivations behind the research, about the different perspectives on vaping, what are you still curious about? What kind of studies do you think we need to see in the future to get a clearer understanding of how things like smoking and vaping truly impact our health?
Yeah, what questions are still lingering for you? Let us know. And that's it for this deep dive.
Until next time.